Former Vice President Joe Biden has not yet announced whether he'll be running for president, but he is already putting out his first fire. Today, former staff members and allies of Biden are coming to his defense. Former Nevada state lawmaker Lucy Flores says that during a 2014 campaign event, Biden placed his hands on her shoulder, smelled her hair, and gave her a kiss on the back of the head. She says she does not consider the interaction harassment or assault.
I don't believe that it was a bad intention. I'm not in any way suggesting that I felt sexually assaulted or sexually harassed. I felt invaded. I felt that there was a violation of my personal space. There has to be at least an awareness on his part that says, I might not have intended it in that way, but I understand because of the power difference there, because of the context, because we have absolutely no relationship, that I shouldn't have kissed you in that way.
After the allegations were made, Biden responded in a statement saying this, quote, "In my many years on the campaign trail and in public life, I have offered countless handshakes, hugs, expressions of affection, support, and comfort. And not once did I believe I ever acted inappropriately. If it is suggested I did so, I will listen respectfully, but it was never my intention." It is worth noting that while NBC News has not independently verified this specific incident took place, we have reviewed correspondence provided by Flores that appears to corroborate that she discussed the incident she alleges around the time Flores says it occurred. Here with the latest, NBC's Mike Memoli, who has spent years covering Joe Biden. Walk us through this, Mike. What is going on within Joe Biden's team? How are they reacting to this? Again, this is a guy who has been in the public eye for decades at a time when cultural norms, accepted behavior has shifted.
Yeah, that's right, Steph. And of course, one of the interesting dynamics here is that there is not yet a Joe Biden campaign. We just have turned the calendar toward April. We do expect, if the vice president is proceeding as planned, that he would make an announcement later this month. But they have not built out this sort of infrastructure of a campaign that would help them to respond to this. But I will say, Joe Biden in his public career has spent a lot of time working on issues of sexual assault. He wrote the Violence Against Women Act. Just last week, I was at an event in New York for one of the entities he created after leaving the White House about sexual assault on college campuses. So his team, very mindful of that, wants to be respectful of Flores. And in the weekend, there was a lot of care taken not to dispute her account and to say with the deepest respect that she is entitled to speak out now. But there's also concern now, given some of the comments we've seen from Flores, both in that interview last night with Casey Hunt and also on ABC, that she has explicitly said that she brought this forward now because of politics. She was a Bernie Sanders supporter in 2016, we should mention. And there is some discomfort, I would say, among his team that this is something that is being done for very conspicuous timing reasons. Now, I will say I've also spoken to some of the women we've seen come forward who worked for the vice president, speaking out now, praising the past record he has in working with women and promoting women in his office. This is largely an organic thing that's happening. The team, the vice president's team, is not necessarily coordinating this. There's a very real effort now not to dispute her account, but to make clear that they view the vice president as a man of character, and that in some ways this may very well be a character attack against him.
Well, this may be an opportunity to learn about workplace conduct because we know the rules are changing. Joining me now to weigh in on this, NBC News senior politics editor Beth Phui, and my panel back with me, Congressman Costello and Congressman Israel. I want to start, though, with some of what John Ralston wrote, the editor of the Nevada Independent, who has been covering Nevada politics for years. He wrote about it this weekend, specifically about Flores's run back in 2014. He says, "She was seen as very ambitious, ran for lieutenant governor in a disastrous year for Democrats after Harry Reid called her the perfect candidate. She got destroyed in that race. In fact, Biden didn't even come for her to the 2014 event she wrote about. That race was already lost. Biden came to try to get Dems to turn out and stave Stephen Horsford, who would barely lose. Flores lost in a landslide, fell out of favor with Harry Reid and company. She lashed out at many in the establishment." Congressman Israel, here's what's complicated. We're wrestling with a time when every woman should be heard.
That's right.
Where we need the power dynamic to change, but we're also dealing with a very political, heated environment with somebody who did potentially back Bernie Sanders at a time when Joe Biden could enter a race as a frontrunner, as a centrist. How do you manage all of this?
It's very difficult to manage, but here's what's important. Ms. Flores felt that her space was invaded. As long as she felt that way, then her concern needs to be aired and addressed. Now, she has said that the vice president had no ill intention. He wasn't menacing. And all she wants him to do is understand how she felt. He's put out a statement saying he understands how she felt. Issue is this. Ryan and I have known Joe Biden for quite some time. I was the chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee.
Yeah, but he might not have kissed
your
head.
That is true. But I have watched him. He exudes empathy. He has expansive body language. That's going to need to change. We are in a new world. We have different rules. We have a new culture. And so the byword is going to have to be respect, not necessarily empathy. And every presidential candidate is going to have to play by those rules.
Beth, right now Joe Biden is polling very well, but you have spent a lot of time with voters in places like Iowa who prioritize electability.
Right.
Is this going to affect his?
See, that's the big, huge issue that is overtaking sort of everything in this race. We've got a very big field, 15, 16 candidates now in the field, all of them pretty impressive in terms of their experience, in terms of what they bring to the table. Basically, all Democrats want right now is somebody who's going to beat Trump. And every time some of these allegations come out against, Biden or anybody else, that chips away at that belief about electability is going to be a problem. It's particularly in the case for Biden, and not because anybody thinks that he's a sexual pervert. He's a man of character, is probably, as you both guys know and would say. It's really that he's a candidate of the past. He's somebody for whom this sort of handsy touching of women, of people that he likes, very acceptable, perhaps at a time, isn't so much anymore. He's a man who's praised Strom Thurmond, who was friendly with him in the Senate, who said that Mike Pence was a decent guy. These are things that very much have a kind of a relic of a time where people were supposed to be bipartisan, reach across the aisle, have relationships. That's not really where the Democratic Party is right now. The Democratic Party wants a fighter, somebody who's going to stand up to Trump, somebody, yes, potentially who could bring everybody together in that goal, but certainly not to sort of praise Republicans, nor to say,
But isn't some level of bipartisanship, if the goal is to get stuff done, if Americans across the board want to live their best life, and they're not necessarily rooted in politics, but there is some level of bipartisanship or working with the other party. If it's just, I'm going to smash your face into the mud and twist it, that kind of gets you to a whole heck of a lot of gridlock.
Yeah, but somebody needs to win this primary. And the fired up primary voters are Democrats who want to take down Trump. And they want they want to know that the person who's going to emerge from this field is that person. And right now, anytime Biden has to defend himself for behavior that, perhaps was appropriate in the olden days, but isn't so much anymore, it's problematic for those voters seeing him in that light.
Congressman Costello, I want to share this because there's a picture making its way around. Stephanie Carter, she is the wife of former Defense Secretary Ash Carter. She weighed in because there is a picture of Joe Biden with his hands on her shoulders during her husband's swearing-in ceremony that has been long characterized as inappropriate. People in the last day have said a picture tells 1,000 words, but she actually came out defending Joe Biden and said this. She said, by the time then Vice President Biden had arrived, it was a traumatic day for her. He could sense I was uncharacteristically nervous and quickly gave me a hug. After the swearing in, as Ash was giving his remarks, he leaned in to tell me, thank you for letting him do this, and kept his hands on my shoulders as a means of offering his support. So this is the woman who it actually happened to, saying there was nothing. But in this era of Me Too, in this era of social media where you look at one picture and it defines someone forever, what could be the impact of something like this?
Well, if Joe Biden hadn't handled this or his team hadn't handled this properly, I think there could be something more to it in terms of a political fallout. But I look at the way that Biden and his allies have handled this, and he did it the right way. He did not attack Flores. He did not question her credibility. He just said, if you felt that uncomfortable, I apologize, and that was it. And I think that that's a very good lesson for anybody in the political sphere, or frankly, in this country, that if somebody does make an accusation towards you of this variety, this is not no one's saying sexual assault or anything of the sort. I don't think that allegation has ever been made against him. That's just not the kind of...
things get... Even if no one's made that allegation,
sure,
things move quickly, especially in the social media stratosphere.
I do, but I think our culture has now adapted to that, and very few people are willing to say, I saw a picture, that is absolutely ipso facto guaranteed you're guilty. And I think that calmly and appropriately he has handled this the way that you should handle it. That's how I feel. And I think others, frankly, are pointing to Flores, and Ralston reported what he reported. And I think it's the smart thing to do not to talk about the accuser, and Joe Biden did not do that in this instance.
Congressman, you chaired the DCCC raising money for a number of Democratic candidates. How difficult is it right now in this primary, given how big the tent is, to get everyone on the same page? Yes, universally, they all want to beat Trump, but in different ways.
Well, first of all, every poll that I've seen says that active Democrats would rather have a Democratic candidate who can beat Trump than one who agrees with them on all issues. So pragmatism is trumping purity in this primary. On the fundraising, we're seeing a whole new world right now, Stephanie. I mean, it used to be you posted numbers and that's all you needed to do. Now it's not just how much money you've raised, it's how many donors you've raised from. And so Beto, for example, $6 to $7 million. But he also said from 128,000 separate donors. This thing is just exploding. I don't know how many dozens of times a day from presidential candidates saying, I need $1, I need $3.
Because every vote counts.
Because every vote counts, and the number of donors is vitally important.
And Stephanie, on that point, that's another problematic situation for Joe Biden. He has never had to grow a online fundraising base. It doesn't exist for him at this point. He was a senator from Delaware for 30 years, never had a serious opponent, so never really had that kind of national fundraising base to begin with. On top of that, you need your online, folks who are sending you $5, $20, $25. He's going to have to start that sort of day one, growing up that kind of fundraising. So what he's going to end up having to do in the first few months of this race, if he gets in, is going to those cocktail parties in New York and LA and the Hamptons and shaking down rich people for $2,800 contributions. But if that's not the way that anybody wants to raise money these days, but that's what he's going to have to do until that online fundraising base gets going for him.
But if Mike Bloomberg takes the massive infrastructure he has already put in place, right? He hired an all-star tech team and plugs that in and plugs in his mega dollars to Joe Biden. Doesn't that sort of immediately solve for it?
I don't think it's going to happen quite that way. Biden has to make the case. Biden has to go look at these donors in the eye. You guys tell me. You guys just did fundraising all these years, and make the case that he's the guy to run and to beat Trump. That's the way he's going to raise money from these folks.
Right now, Pete Buttigieg seems to be doing that.
He's doing a great job. But, this is the proverbial marathon, not the sprint. Let's see how this plays out over the next 9 months to the Iowa caucus. Fasten your seatbelts. 9 more months before we have the first caucus.
My goodness. And we're saying, Joe, hurry up already. Seriously, there's 9 more months. There's a ways away.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.